Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 61. If you spent any time trying to understand our outrage-fueled political landscape, you've probably had The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt recommended to you, maybe more than once. And for good reason. It's been a foundational book for how we think about morality, political differences, and why we just can't seem to see eye to eye. It gave us moral foundations theory, the idea that our political leanings stem from deep-seated moral instincts. And for over a decade, it has been the go-to framework for explaining the psychology behind our political divide. But here's the thing. What if it's time to move on? What if moral foundations theory isn't the final word on why we're so divided? What if our political tribalism and culture wars aren't just about discrete moral intuitions like purity and loyalty, but something even more visceral? And that's where today's guest comes in.
My name is Kurt Gray. I'm professor of psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, where I direct the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. And next fall, I'll be the Weary Family Endowed Chair in the Social Psychology of Polarization and Misinformation, it's a mouthful, at The Ohio State University. I'm excited for that move.
Dr. Gray was one of the very first guests to help launch this show. And now he's back with a book that isn't just adding to the conversation, it's redefining it. Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality in Politics and How to Find Common Ground isn't just another take on why we're so divided. It's a paradigm shift, a bold new framework for understanding morality itself. If The Righteous Mind set the baseline for how we talk about morality in politics, Outraged is poised to set the new standard, one that finally accounts for the intensity, velocity, and addictiveness of outrage in today's world. In this conversation, we'll dig into the ideas behind Outraged, challenge some of our long-held assumptions about morality and politics, and explore what this all means for escaping the outrage trap. Let's get into it right now. Kurt Gray, thank you so much for making time for us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. So your book introduces three myths. I'm going to frame them. This may not be the exact right language, but I'll frame them as the myth of human nature, the myth of moral mind, and the myth that facts bridge divides. And I love this idea. And obviously, we're not going to go into full detail, but can you just give us maybe a touch on briefly those three myths?
Sure. And so I think of them as the kind of past, present, and future myths is a nice way to organize it. So the myth of how we think about the past is that we evolved, human nature, as predators. And although we're apex predators today, I argue and marshal a lot of anthropological evidence that we evolved more as prey than as predators, as more hunted than hunter. And that changes how we think about the present moment, where the myth that I cover is that there are some of our moral judgments that are disconnected from harm. And that's a big, debate in my field right now in moral psychology. How does our mind make moral decisions? Some folks, like Jonathan Haidt, argues that, liberals and conservatives have different minds with fundamentally different concerns. My work shows that all of our moral judgments are ultimately grounded in concerns about harm. And if you want to understand why someone says something's wrong, ask yourself, what harms do they see? And then the myth about the future, about how we can move together as a nation and as a society to be less angry, less outraged, is the myth of facts being able to bridge divides. So most people think that the best way to have conversations with people who disagree with them is by emphasizing facts. But when you give them the facts, they say those are not the right facts, those are wrong facts, those are fake facts. Instead, the best way to create understanding across political divides and any moral divides, really, is by emphasizing your personal experiences related to an issue, especially personal experiences of harm, where you might feel vulnerable or in some way victimized. And it's those stories that allow people to see you as rational and worthy of respect. So those are the three myths: human nature, our moral mind today, and bridging divides in the future.
No, that's great. So we're going to try to cover as much as we can about each of those and maybe a few other things. But so let's start with the harm-based model. of morality a little bit. I think about in my personal case, my whole sort of political lifetime, let's say, I've kind of viewed conservatives of having this mean-spirited side to them. Like this goes all the way back to like Nixon to Reagan, guys like Newt Gingrich, and some of those that are out there today. And but in your framework here, I mean, I'd have to say that these people see themselves as protecting against different harms than I do. Like we have differences in who or what we perceive as vulnerable. So can you just talk about that a little bit and the idea of moral understanding?
You bet. And so a kind of core idea that kicks off the book is that when we think about the other side, like you just said, we think that they are trying to destroy the world, right? They're bent on destruction. And yet, I mean, I think conservatives think this is about liberals too, right? They're trying to destroy the order and traditions that America has built, throw it all away. But in reality, when you look at how the other side actually makes their moral judgments, actually what drives their behavior, it's not the desire to destroy. If listeners right now think about why they voted for the candidate they voted for, it wasn't because they wanted to burn the world down. It was because they wanted to protect certain things, protect rights, protect, things that they care about. And so really all of us are motivated by protection, and all of us are trying to make the world a better place for ourselves, our family, and the vulnerable that we see in society.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much like I want to go down there a little further, but I want to jump to for now. I want to jump to the sort of idea myth 3 part, the idea of facts. How a lot of people just jump into everything with facts because this is something that comes up a lot with listeners and different guests I've had on the show. And you see, I'm a moderator for Crossing Party Lines, which is another group that tries to sort of organize these kind of conversations and with people sharing their different perspectives. And as part of our moderator role is to try to like have people not do what that group calls kind of facting, this idea of kind of weaponizing facts, and the idea is kind of like, look, we know you have good facts. We want to hear your personal reason for why you think this, that kind of thing, right? And people push back on that and say, no, you're naive. You don't understand. Facts are the whole thing. But there's also an irony in this that here I'm trying to run a podcast and being a storyteller as much as I can, but we're often telling all of us that the fact that storytelling works, and even that people have pushback on. We're sort of telling people the fact that we're trying to prove this point that storytelling works by telling people facts. So, a big part of this is, like how do we get better skills at telling stories? I know in the book there was this idea of story exchange. I really liked that. But maybe you can talk about that a little bit, like some practical tools. And, for some issues where we want to talk about it with someone, we may not have a personal story. I mean, maybe we always do. We're just not looking hard enough for it. But maybe you can just kind of riff off some of those ideas.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I like the meta point too about the science and the facts show that storytelling is important. Remember the book got reviewed in the New Yorker, and they're always trying to be clever, and that's like the clever little twist they did. It's like Gray tells us that stories are effective, but then he uses facts, to like point taken, it's kind of meta. But it is true that when we think about how best to bridge divides, we're like, let's do the facting. I like that word. And the allure of facts is obvious because facts do matter. I mean, I'm a scientist, I study facts. Science is about facts. But the problem is we inhabit different media ecosystems where the facts we get are kind of, sound bites from MSNBC or Fox News. And they're very particular facts with a very particular bent. And, we can argue about the statistical truth of your facts or their facts. But at the end of the day, if you just imagine an argument and just like throwing things at each other, it's not going to make that argument better. And even if facts matter, they're not going to start the process of like coming together and understanding. I mean, you can just think about it, right? Like, when's the last time you gave up your moral position because someone had just like the right fact, right? Like, did you know this? I heard this on NPR, and someone's like, oh my goodness, you're so right. I guess I'll give up my view on abortion, right? It never happens. So instead, I think what you do with that group is amazing, right? Like, you want to make it personal and say, this is where I'm coming from. And then your personal story doesn't argue that the other person's personal story is somehow wrong in the way that facts do, right? Like we're both sharing who we are and we're both trying to understand where we're coming from. And once the conversation is about understanding and personal kind of connection, it goes a lot better. As you mentioned, not everyone has a story about, you know, gun violence or using a gun in self-defense if we're talking about guns. But I think you can still kind of ground it more in the personal with your feelings and your sensations and your thoughts about the issue that come from you, your family and your upbringing and not just from talking points and cable news. If you make it about that and not about trying to convince or prove someone else wrong, conversations go a lot better, at least at first, right? And then you can talk about facts, but focus first on stories and your personal feelings.
Yeah, and it's like I had David Helfand on, and he was kind of talking about how science needs like a PR department, like a marketing department, to be able to sell this stuff. Because PSAs and things like that, we're still trying to sell things with just rattling off facts, and we know it doesn't work. We still do it. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that too, because David McCraney kind of talks about this idea of, maybe instead of going into a conversation with a kind of us and them, and I'm going to win, you're going to lose, somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. He talks about this idea of maybe going into we're going to go on a detective mission together, and we're both going to try to understand why the other side sees the world differently than we do. What do you think about that?
I love that idea. I mean, it makes me think of there's all sorts of research on how to approach negotiations. Usually in business, but it could be with a spouse, it could be any kind of contentious issue where you have some differing opinions. And there's different metaphors that we can bring to bear on negotiations. So those metaphors can be a fight, winner takes all. There's a clear winner and a loser. It could be problem solving, right? Like a detective, we're trying to figure things out together where we're coming from. I've even heard people frame negotiations as like a dance in a sense, which I kind of like, we're kind of coordinating our movements together to try to figure out, how you think and how you feel about these things. And so I think anything is better than a kind of winner take all, fight about the facts. Problem solving is great. Anything where you're like, we're doing this together and I'm trying to figure things out about you and you're trying to figure things out about me. Well, that makes it less of an antagonistic interaction and more of something that we can learn from each other.
Yeah, it definitely seems like one of the hardest things, hardest message I have to get across. Maybe we'll come back to this some more, but for now, I'm going to move on to, you talk about this idea of concept creep with respect to harm and how this leads to the perception of morality the perception that morality has decreased every generation. I mean, I really love that, even though sort of like we're as safe as we've ever been, but we have this idea that things keep getting worse. Talk about that phenomenon a little bit, and do you have some ideas for sort of combating this tendency? Is it kind of related to negativity bias, maybe, or anyway, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, every generation from the Roman Empire forward has thought that things are getting worse, right? That it used to be great, we used to be moral, kids used to be good, and now kids these days, right? You can show like Pliny the Elder or whoever is writing about, kids these days and how things are worse than they used to be, and neighbors are less kind and compassionate. So why is it always the case? Well, I think that there's lots of different explanations, but I think one explanation that I focus on in the book is this idea that society is actually getting, on average, better and safer. So kids today are much more protected than they were in the past. And I'm not talking coddled, although, you could think about that too. But just you're less likely to get caught in a fridge and suffocate. You're less likely to drown because pools have fences now. You're less likely to die in an auto crash because we have seatbelts. There's all sorts of innovations that have made people and especially kids safer. And yet, because we evolved to care about harm, right, to protect ourselves, and that harms are not only, specific dangers to our kids, but also evil people pose a threat as well, right? And so we're fixated on wondering what threats exist and who is likely to be evil. And so what this means is because we're safer, we're projecting these threats and this evilness on lots of new circumstances that are actually not evil, probably. Right. So the example I like is, your kids are playing outside on the front lawn, and a white panel van drives slowly by and then turns around and then drives slowly by again. And your first intuition as a parent is not, I wonder if that's a lost locksmith, but instead, I bet that's a kidnapper, right? Trying to like steal my kids. When we know that kidnappings by strangers are so rare, right? They basically never happen. And yet our mind projects that. And so the broader idea that you mentioned is that like the idea of what's harmful and dangerous and threatening has crept, right? And now includes all sorts of new things that we weren't really worried about before. And so some of those things are, I don't know, like micro expressions are a good example, right? Like the kind of looks that people give you in the hall. I've heard folks both on the left and the right kind of worry about those things. And I think if you went back 200 years ago and you said, like, this is an example of harm, this is an example of threat, they think, that's silly because we have real threats and real harms to worry about. But because we're safer, our idea of what is harmful and what is immoral has crept.
Yeah, and in the book, you kind of talk about this idea we're always sort of looking for harms. Like we have a baseline, we have to our a bucket we have to fill with harms, no matter what. So this might be a little difficult, but maybe not. And I don't want to spend all our time here, but it's certainly something that's very interesting to me. And again, kind of putting it in a frame of kind of a personal case. We're talking about sort of morality and just toxic polarization in these conversations. And I'm not necessarily talking about with experts, but just general folks in the public. So a lot of people point me to The Righteous Mind. And they say things like, read that and all your questions will be answered. Like you'll completely understand, the political dynamic and so on. And A, I'm like, okay, as if I haven't read it yet. And B, maybe things aren't quite that simple. So to me, you've written a book that seems poised to really significantly impact this field. And particularly its reevaluation of some of the core ideas presented in The Righteous Mind. So I'm curious what kind of reaction, if any, have you gotten from Jonathan Haidt and or maybe other advocates of moral foundations theory?
Yeah, it's a good question. So John and I have debated the kind of structure of the moral mind for some time. I mean, probably since around 2012, we really started the debate in earnest. We've had some debates in person, kind of standing room only discussions or arguments, depending on how you want to frame it, at our kind of national conferences. I think, Haidt does a good job of recognizing that morality varies between people, between liberals and conservatives, between societies. But I think I was not convinced about this idea of different moral foundations, about the specific way he thinks we differ and the way the mind works. Like we've got these 5 modules in our head, in our mind. And, increasingly as I collected data, it just was clear that the data are so much stronger for this idea that we have a harm-based mind. And what does John think? Well, he hasn't talked with me about this for some time. I think he's too busy thinking about kids and screens. But certainly there's lots of other folks kind of he works with that are kind of like trying to criticize this view that all of morality kind of connects to harm. And I think the way they criticize it is they argue that I'm arguing that morality does not have this rich diversity, right? That morality does not vary between people or cultures. But I'm arguing that it does, just like they do. But I'm suggesting that the kind of roots of these differences, the roots of our variation of morality across cultures and politics, are different perceptions of harm. And now I've finally got some data, and it's in the book, about how liberals and conservatives make sense of harm differently, make sense differently of who's especially vulnerable to suffering and victimization. And those are the things that underlie our moral debates, our hot button issues today, not questions of authority or loyalty or purity, because it turns out if you really look at the data, liberals and conservatives don't differ on those issues. And those issues aren't separate either. They're not foundations and they're not uniquely conservative. And so the whole theory, I think, falls apart if you look a little closer.
I want to touch on something you mentioned there because I think this will come up, and I just want to at least cover it a little bit. This idea that harms are can vary between cultures and other groups. And then we start, but then I can hear some people saying, well, aren't you now talking about moral relativism? And now why there is no morality under this, and, that kind of thing. So maybe you can just speak, if we don't have morals, then what do we have? We have nothing. Why should we try to be good? You've probably heard these kinds of arguments.
Yeah, you bet. Especially when I, speak with religious communities, faith-based communities, right? This idea of like absolute moral truths, especially related to God. And I think I have to say, well, first, I'm a moral psychologist, so I'm not interested in, I am interested as like a person who's, living in the world, but I don't study kind of moral truths like philosophers do. Instead, I study the moral mind. And that means that I look at how people descriptively make their moral judgments, how people decide what's right or wrong. And I think that connecting it to this idea of, Jonathan Haidt and the moral foundations, he, like every other moral psychologist, including me, thinks that morality does vary across culture and across people. You just look at America today, right? People are disagreeing on immigration and abortion and taxes, right? What's the moral thing to do? I think the key is that I'm saying that conceptions and perceptions of harm also vary across cultures, and that's what gives rise to our differences in moral judgment. Whereas I think John would say, look, harm is just one thing. It's just kind of direct physical harm, and it's obvious, and we don't need to think more about it. And then there's other values that are disconnected from harm, like purity. And those values are respected by conservatives, but not liberals. I think that's not true, right? This idea of purity, maybe conservatives are a little more religious and care about that kind of sexual purity, let's say. But certainly if you hear someone doing a 3-day juice cleanse and then going on a yoga retreat to purify their chakras, that's probably a liberal, right? And so all I'm saying is that, of course, morality varies descriptively, right? The science shows that it does. And I'm just saying that the science also shows that our understandings of harm are also variable, and those understandings predict our moral judgments.
Mm-hmm. So I really found the discussions of research where they've used this idea of the public goods game to examine the application of outrage. And I found that really interesting. It talks about how a significant majority of participants in these games chose to punish free riders. And even though it was technically irrational from a purely economic perspective, like there was nothing to gain, but they still do it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So,
like, why does that happen?
Yeah. The book is really about, how we can feel less outraged and explaining why we feel outraged. But, and I think today, we're overloaded, as you might say, on outrage. But outrage also serves a really important function for living in groups. Morality serves an important function. And ultimately, to go back to the very first myth, right, we evolved more as prey than as predators. We're kind of hunted, we're worried. The way that we protect ourselves is by getting together into groups, right? It's just like every other kind of species that's hunted, deer, monkeys, chimpanzees even, right? We form groups, but now that we're in a group, there's other challenges. So other people can hurt us, they can threaten us, they can steal from us. They can socially loaf, which means that we work hard and they get the benefits. If you've ever done a group project at school or at work, this happens. And when someone gets the same grade as you and they didn't do anything, you get angry, right? You get outraged. And basically what they're doing is they're breaking the core tenet of morality, which is that everyone has to cooperate to achieve the same group goals. And when someone doesn't cooperate, when someone free rides or loafs, it makes us angry, and then we want to punish them. And the idea of punishing these people who don't do anything is in some sense, useless, right? Like, let's say you finish the group project, you all get an A, and then you're like, well, this other person, they didn't do very much work, but you've already got the A, but you still want to write to your professor, at least people write to me, and just like slam the group member, right? Even if it can come back and makes them look petty, or maybe they'll get in a fight, with this other person. They still want to do it, right? We still get outraged at free riders. And it's actually a very rational thing to want to do this and to do it, because if people know that you are going to get outraged at their social loafing, at their free riding, and you're going to punish them, even at cost to yourself, they are less likely to socially loaf, right? If you join my group and I tell you, look, we're working on this project together, and I don't care what grade we get. If you mess around and don't pull your weight, I'm just going to go nuclear on you and like tell the professor and make sure that your grade suffers. So like just keep that. I'll go to the ends of the earth to make sure that you pay, right? And like with this person, you're like, well, one, that's kind of crazy, but their craziness is going to make me work hard and not socially low. So that's how outrage in that kind of cheating, free riding situation can be rational.
Right. That's great. So let's move to solutions and where we how do we maybe get out of this. And we talked a little bit about storytelling versus facts before, and in the book, a lot of it is focused on having better conversations. Yeah, you write, quote, research finds that correcting these overly negative meta perceptions decreases partisan animosity, end quote. And we've looked at some of that research here on the show. So are conversations the best answer? I mean, do you think conversations can scale? Are there maybe some bigger systemic solutions we could look at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think conversations are essential. I think conversations can be between, spouses, can be between neighbors, coworkers, people on the subway. Conversations can also be between congresspeople, senators, right, CEOs. And so conversations matter for all sorts of folks in society, especially those that have kind of more systemic power. In addition to that, I think there are institutional changes that are essential for reducing polarization in America. It's hard to get those institutional changes done, right? Like we have a two-party system. It's really hard to make America a three-party system or more, like Canada or like places in Europe. It's hard to eliminate the primary system, which increases hostility, right? Politicians pandering to their base. But like, would we want to? I don't know, right? Direct democracy has some appeal. So there's so many kind of changes that I think are useful. But at the same time, right, putting those changes aside, the one thing that individuals we can control beyond our vote rather, and our donations is having more conversations with the other side, understanding what they're thinking, right, knowing what drives their behavior, and then once we have that understanding, using that to kind of further, social goals.
Right. I often try to reframe, listening and having those conversations instead of like you're not doing the other person a favor, right? You're think of it more. You're doing it for yourself, and if you want to be an advocate, you can't be a very good advocate if you really don't understand what the other person's real concerns are.
Exactly.
So on this part of this, the book has a whole part. So listeners, you got to check out the book. I mean, it's got a whole section of practically how to do this in practical ways. But you introduced this acronym CIV, which is connect, invite, and validate. So I sort of love acronyms. So I guess I want to kind of ask a little bit. We probably won't have time to go into all the details of what that is. But have you've been out talking about the book for a while, and I don't know if you've have any organizations reach out and it's like, hey, can we have this acronym and can we do something with it? Maybe start a whole movement around this. Have you seen any kind of movement like that, or can we take this and really do something with it?
So I think there has been a lot of interest in the book and the insights from the book, including these practical tips for better conversations. I mean, are folks taking these specific tips? I think some folks, right, when I give talks, but these tips were really taken from organizations and people who are already in the community and doing the best practices for bridging really contentious divides. So in the chapter where I present them, I talk about John Saroof at Essential Partners, and they are a pioneering organization that work to bridge divides in divided communities. And so I got the tips from John, and I'm very happy. I kind of package it in a way that's maybe a little neater and a little tighter because it's, one chapter in a book on these conversations than Essential Partners do, although they have a whole guide about this that I'd encourage folks to check out. But I think there is a lot of kind of excitement for from everyday folks about like, well, how can I have better conversation? Is there an easy way to think about this? And that's what I try to do with the CIV, right? Connect, invite, validate, a simple way to have better conversations and kind of open up your kind of connection with someone in order to kind of share those personal experiences. Because it's hard to share those personal experiences at first. But once you kind of connect, invite, and validate, right, it's a lot easier to kind of understand where they're coming from.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I love it. Yeah, and like I say, folks, I mean, definitely check out the book, and it's very got some very practical a practical toolbox there. So I literally have dozens of more questions. I'd love to talk to you for probably another hour or two, but we're not going to be able to do that. So I was going to maybe wrap up with this. You have this whole lab, and you just mentioned talking to other organizations, and you study, people and phenomena out there related to these things. I just have this little podcast, and I learn from dozens of experts, and I have a hard time finding optimism. Right, this is a tough business to be in. How do you stay engaged in this work?
Optimism is, maybe in short supply in the political climate today. I think what keeps me going, I mean, one is that apathy and despair are not very useful. So even just practically, like one, it's good to do something rather than nothing. And two, I think, you know, if you want to affect change, if you're progressive, let's say, and you want to affect some change, but you feel like you've lost the election and you lack kind of power, well, then understanding the other side is even more important, right? Like if you want to build coalitions and find allies, then you really need to understand how people on the other side voted and what their concerns are so that you can kind of make sure those concerns are better addressed next election, whatever, right? Like it's imperative to kind of understand where folks are coming from. And not only is there like this pragmatic goal, but I think deep in my heart, and I know I share this view with many people, is that people are fundamentally good, right? As a social psychologist, I tend to think that people are fundamentally good, and we're born good, and everyone's born wanting to do the right thing. There's maybe 1% of people who are psychopaths. Let's leave them aside. But 99% of people, right, are trying to do their best to protect themselves and their family and the vulnerable. But systems and context can make that harder for them to do. And so I think by understanding where they're coming from, and one thing that makes people like not be kind to others is when they feel threatened, right? Kind of if you feel cornered, you're going to lash out, you're going to be aggressive, right? And so it turns out that the way to make people be kinder and happier is to make them feel less threatened. And part of that is understanding where they're coming from, allow them to be heard and seen, and they'll be kinder to you as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So do you think, just to kind of a brief follow up on that, do you think this kind of this over time, this has been this is not like you came up with this one Tuesday. You've been working on this kind of harm-based model for a while. Do you think that harm-based model kind of helps you sort of with this conclusion that people are basically good?
Absolutely. I mean, and it helps me think that, people are good, but also like it also grew out of this idea of social psychology that's very deep, right? That people are generally trying to do their best. And this deep evolutionary kind of truth that we're all concerned about harm, right? We're all trying to protect ourselves. It's the most fundamental drive for every organism, right? Is to protect ourselves and our society and our families. And so when you appreciate this fundamental truth, you see our minds differently. And as the data kept rolling in, I mean, every time I run a study, what comes out is that it's perceptions of harm that best predict our judgments. And that's what we're worried about. And I think it's really useful for understanding political divides too. I was talking to some lawyers in Texas. They're progressive lawyers. They're trying to make Texas kind of more, pro-immigration. And they realized that a lot of their ad campaigns weren't really working because they were emphasizing, values like moral foundations, right? And it wasn't moving the needle at all. And then speaking to some ranchers who were kind of anti-open borders, they realized why. So these ranchers, in the middle of the night, if they leave their lights on, you know, migrants and coyotes, right, coming up from Mexico will see the lights on at their house and kind of like rush their house looking for food and fresh water. And these, the migrants are like suffering. They're bilked out of a ton of money by the coyotes. They don't have water. They don't have food. They're starving. But if you put yourself in the shoes of this rancher and his family, there's people banging on the doors. His kids are woken up. They feel like they're under attack. And so when they kind of understood where people were coming from and the kind of threats that they were experiencing, it allowed them to think, I think more clear-eyed about immigration policy and how to kind of connect with these people with very reasonable concerns on the border, right? So I think always understanding the kind of harms that people see is a opening to seeing the good within them, but also trying to figure out how to really, think about policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's in the book, or maybe I just heard you say it, but I think it's in the book. You talk a little bit about, people don't wake up in the morning going, how can I, sort of screw up the world? Like they wake up in the morning going, these are the things I'm concerned about. These are the things I perceive as harms. And I think thinking about it that way can help break you from this idea that they're not like just out, they're just looking at the world differently than you. It's not that they're sort of these evil people.
Right. I mean, right. You get up in the morning and probably the first thing you think about is like your worries. You think about your day, you think about your kids, you think about society. And it's always like a little bit of anxiety. And I don't know, unless you're super chill, but I haven't met anyone who doesn't worry about things in the morning when they first wake up. And what's true of you is true of other people, right? Other people who vote differently are also worried about things, right? They're also worried about their family. They also have everyday concerns. So appreciating that, I think, goes a long way to making you realize that, the other side's not out to get you. And the other side doesn't hate you, right? We vastly overestimate how much the other side actually dislikes you, right? Mostly they just want to get by and get their stuff done. And so appreciating that, I think, is also an important step to kind of being less outraged.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Dr. Gray, thank you so much for making time for us. Again, I've got another 20 questions I could ask, and we can't do that today, but I'm so glad you made time for us.
Thanks for having me on the show. Always a pleasure.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.